In today's video, I wanted to discuss some issues about muscle activation when you're doing strengthening related exercise. It's a situation we see quite commonly clinically where people may have restarted an exercise program, maybe have had a period of time of inactivity or just getting back to some sort of work after childbirth, or maybe have had medical scares and realize they need to make some lifestyle changes. And they work right through some body weight strengthening exercises or maybe some gym work, depending on what appeals to them. And they go through a sequence of exercises which are geared towards targeting different body parts, but they don't get much of a training effect from the work that they're putting in. And one of the common reasons we see for that is that they are not actually getting activation of the target muscles that they're trying to work with an exercise. So let's say a bridging exercise, if you're lying on your back with your knees bent and you're lifting your hips up, the prime muscles that should work there are in your buttock. But very often people just overly arch or hyperextend their back. So they use their back muscles, they thrust their head and shoulders back into the ground, and they shunt the loading from the prime target of the glutes and buttock areas into the upper back. Essentially, you don't get much of a training effect by doing this. But this situation happens in many, many different exercises. We often see people who do planks and can say, hold a plank for a minute or two, and you ask them where they feel it, and they tell you they feel it pressurizing the lower part of their back. And that's basically because they haven't sufficiently activated the abdominal muscles, or because they've held the position too long and reached the point of fatigue, and therefore the primary muscle activation starts to switch or shunt to some other areas, because the body will just think of what's required to get the job done. So that's a very common thing we see in clinic, and it's quite frustrating for people because they're very well intentioned and they may have restructured their daily living in order to accommodate exercise, but they just don't get the effects of it. And this is particularly true if we're looking at activities to stimulate muscle strength. At the other end of the spectrum, we'll also see it in people who are training athletically in the gym, and blokes will be typical for this, in that they might end up loading too much weight on and the form on the exercise would break down. So apart from the obvious risks of potential injury, it often means that they end up overloading joints and don't really get the muscle activation in the target muscles. Heavy squats would be a classic example of this, where people tend to load the bar too heavy, lean forwards into the squat, end up putting a lot of pressure on the knees, on the lower back, rather than working with a lighter load, maybe only working to half range to a box squat and keeping the torso upright, and then really loading through the quads, through the core and through the buttock. So there are easy ways to correct it, provided you're tuned into what's going wrong and what you need to do. But the basic take-home message is that you need to feel the effort in the prime muscles that are involved with the exercise that you're doing. And that's a really important thing. And sometimes if it doesn't happen automatically, you need, before you start the movement, you need to brace or activate the target muscles statically, just making them squeeze, and then use that muscle contraction when you're working through an exercise. So in other words, you've taken away any randomness or any potential for the nervous system to select its own favorite way of doing a movement, and you're forcing it to use the target muscles that you want to activate with a particular exercise in question. And remember too, often the reason you're targeting these muscles specifically is because they're weak or they're not functioning well. So the brain and the motor control system will try and find other ways of achieving a task. So sometimes it's a very subtle, and you have to be really alert as a clinician to look for trick movement patterns. Sometimes it's obvious, but sometimes it's not so obvious. But often you'll find in the history, you'll obviously get a sense that people are frustrated that they're still getting recurrent episodes of pain. Typically, these would be catching, twinging episodes that may or may not cause some inflammation and have them laid up for a day or two, and they just come out of the blue. And those kind of things, where there's not a real clear identifiable trigger, always tell you that the muscle control is compromised, and that you need to do things to make sure the muscle tone stays switched on. And that brings us to another issue, in that muscle strength and muscle tone aren't the same things. Muscle strength, as you would expect, is your ability to generate mass tension. And that is appropriate in certain situations, but most of our daily living, most of us aren't doing mass activation of muscles. We're looking at more day-to-day tasks like bending, twisting, reaching, picking up objects around the house, or children, or what have you. So we're looking at much more modest kind of loading on muscles. And if the coordination or resting tone in the muscle isn't sufficient, those often trigger an acute sprain of the joint, simply because the muscular system isn't switched on and active and ready in preparation for movement. If we're looking more at the sporting end of preparation, we can see now that there's a lot more emphasis on muscle activation drills and sequences before games, and you'll see players out for half an hour, 40 minutes before, where they're working through some stretching, working through a bit of muscle pump activity and activation, and then they're working through some specific skills. But part of that really is to get the musculature fired up and ready for the immediate intensity of sport. So it's not a subject that's often talked about, but one we see very frequently clinically. And often it's not that the wrong exercises are being done. It's simply that people are not getting sufficient activation of the target muscle groups. The other thing that needs to be factored in is that the level of loading has to be on the threshold of your capacity, what you're able to manage, but just with a limited number of reps. If you're working at a level of load that's just too easy, you really won't get a training effect. So you're not really going to enhance the capacity of your system. And if you're working to extreme a level, then you're much more likely to feed into trick movement patterns and substitute patterns that really will bypass you trying to get effective activation in the target area. So that's the clinician's job too, is to find precisely where you are on the scale, and then structure an exercise program to move you forwards from there to what's required for your activities of daily living. So an interesting subject, and one we see frequently in clinic. Hope you found some benefit in that. I'll see you again on another video. Bye for now.